Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're strapping in, or perhaps more accurately, lashing ourselves to the mast, to follow Silas Blackwood, a 17th century harpooner aboard the good ship the Misery's Price. We'll be sailing through one particularly soul-crushing, frost-bitten, and frankly offensively smelly day in the glorious North Atlantic whaling grounds. Before we dive headfirst into the icy brine, questionable shipboard hygiene, and the kind of decision-making that makes you wonder how humanity ever survived the olden days, do take a moment to subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these little peeks into history's most spectacularly unpleasant professions. And for a bit of fun, let me know in the comments below, what's the absolute worst job you've ever had? I bet Silas might just give you a run for your money. Now, go find the warmest, comfiest spot in your house. You'll thank me later, especially after you hear what Silas calls bed. Maybe grab a beverage that doesn't taste faintly of fish oil and despair. And let's begin our descent into the 17th century's version of an extreme sport, where the whales weren't the only ones getting slaughtered. The world, for Silas Blackwood, didn't so much begin as reluctantly ooze back into existence, like congealed fat warming by a very distant, very weak fire. He was pretty sure it was still night, mostly because the usual symphony of suffering that was the forecastle of the Misery's Price was playing its pre-dawn overture, and also because it was colder than a tax collector's heart, colder even than the watery grave that had swallowed young Thomas 2 days prior. Silas grunted, a sound like stones shifting in a sack, and tried to identify which particular misery had clawed him from the shallow pit of his slumber. It wasn't a specific noise, not this time. More like a change in the ship's rhythm, a subtle shift in the groan of timbers that suggested the wind was picking up its usual morning spite. Or maybe it was just the rats. They had a schedule, those rats, ambitious little beasts. His bed, if you could call it that, was a narrow wooden shelf, barely wider than his shoulders, crammed into the triangular gloom of the ship's forecastle. This was luxury living for about 30 souls, packed in like salted fish in a barrel. If the fish were still alive, incredibly unwashed and prone to violent nightmares. There was no mattress, just a thin, lice-infested blanket that might have been white a decade ago, now roughly the color of week-old bilge water. Silas had strategically acquired a slightly thicker, slightly less holy sailcloth scrap over the years, which he used as a pathetic barrier against the damp wood beneath and the enthusiastic chewing of whatever small creatures shared his bunk. He suspected a family of particularly hardy woodlice had taken up permanent residence in the vicinity of his left hip. At least, they didn't snore. The air itself was a physical presence, a thick, gag-inducing soup you could practically chew. It was a potent cocktail of stale sweat from 30 unwashed bodies, the lingering ghosts of meals past, mostly ancient fish and something pretending to be bread. The ever-present acrid tang of whale oil that permeated every plank and fiber of the ship, and of course, the rich, earthy aroma of bilge. Oh, the bilge. That delightful reservoir of everything unwanted. Seawater, vomit, spilled grog, rat droppings, and the general despair of months at sea. It sloshed rhythmically below, a constant fragrant reminder of their precarious existence. Occasionally, a wave would hit the hull just so, and a fresh, eye-watering whiff would surge upwards, a special good morning from the bowels of the Misery's Price. Around him, the darkness was punctuated by a chorus of human misery, snoring that sounded like distant thunderstorms, punctuated by wet, hacking coughs. A popular forecastle melody. Someone was groaning softly, probably old man Finnegan, whose joints had apparently declared war on the rest of his body sometime during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Further off, a string of mumbled curses suggested young Pip was already losing an argument with a rogue wave that had found its way through a leaky seam to douse his bunk. Pip was always damp. It was his defining characteristic. Silas briefly considered if Pip might actually be part fish. It would explain a lot. He didn't so much wake up as surrender to the inevitable. His eyes, gritty and gummed shut, peeled open to absolute blackness. The first sensation, after the cold that seemed to burrow right into his bones, was the familiar throb in his lower back, a souvenir from that one time a whale line had decided to play tug-of-war with his spine. It had won, mostly. Then came the symphony in his joints, each one creaking like a rusty hinge as he dared to move. His left knee, the one a clumsy barrel had tried to amputate a few voyages back, sent a particularly sharp signal of disapproval. Just another day in paradise. He lay there for a moment, a human icicle wrapped in a filthy shroud, listening. The ship pitched, a sudden lurch that sent a cascade of something small and scurrying across his face. Probably just a rat heading for its breakfast. Silas didn't even flinch anymore. He'd learned long ago that flinching in the dark usually meant smacking your head against the low deck beams above, or elbowing the equally miserable unfortunate in the bunk next to him, in this case, a hulking Dutchman named Jan, who had a habit of retaliating with the subtlety of a battering ram, diplomacy through stillness. That was Silas's motto in the forecastle. The cold was the real enemy this morning, though. It wasn't just cold. It was a penetrating, aggressive cold that seemed to have teeth. Late autumn in the North Atlantic, chasing the last of the Greenland right whales further north than sane men ventured, meant flirting with the kind of cold that could freeze your thoughts. He could feel it seeping through his thin blanket, through the worn wool of his shirt, nipping at his exposed ears and nose. He curled tighter, a brief, futile attempt to conserve whatever pathetic warmth his body still possessed. All right, you lazy sea dogs. Rise and shine, the bloody day ain't gonna ruin itself. The bellow came from the hatchway, accompanied by a rhythmic thumping on the deck above. It was the boatswain, Mr. Grimshaw, a man whose voice sounded like he gargled with gravel, and whose disposition made a hungry shark look friendly. Sun's cracking the horizon. A blatant lie, Silas knew. The sun wouldn't dare show its face for another hour at least, not in this god-forsaken latitude at this time of year. Grimshaw just enjoyed the suffering. It was his main source of entertainment. With a groan that was more air escaping stiff lungs than actual sound, Silas began the awkward process of extrication. He swung his legs over the side of the bunk, his bare feet hitting the frigid, damp deck planks. A shiver racked his body with an intensity that made his teeth clack. The wood was slimy in places. He chose not to think about what made it slimy. Some mysteries were best left unsolved, especially when you had to walk on them in the dark. Fumbling. That was the next stage of the morning ritual. Everything was done by feel, in a darkness so complete it felt like being wrapped in black velvet. His clothes were where he'd left them, a damp, stiff pile at the foot of his bunk. Pulling on the coarse woolen trousers felt like wrestling a half-frozen badger. They were still damp from yesterday's spray and sweat, and the cold fabric clung to his skin like a second, much more unpleasant, layer of flesh. His shirt was no better, stiff and smelling faintly of old fish and desperation. He tugged it over his head, the rough wool scratching at his neck. Boots. Ah, the boots. Or rather, the stiff leather buckets that passed for footwear. They were probably home to something small and angry, but his feet were already too numb to care. He stomped them on, wincing as his crooked toes protested their confinement. He ran a hand over his bristly chin, feeling the landscape of scars and weather-beaten skin. No time for the luxury of a shave. Not that there was much fresh water for such frivolities anyway. A quick check by feel. Knife still in its sheath at his belt? Good. You didn't want to be caught without your knife. It was your fork, your weapon, your multi-tool, your best friend in a world that offered few companionships. He fumbled for his flint and steel, tucked into a small leather pouch. After a few clumsy strikes, a tiny spark briefly illuminated his gnarled fingers, then died, Enough. No fires allowed down here anyway, not with 30 men, a mountain of oily rags, and a ship made of wood. That was a recipe for a very quick, very hot trip to the afterlife. His thoughts, as always, were brutally practical. Back's a right bastard this morning. Hope the greenhorn doesn't puke to windward again. Wonder if Cook's managed to make the hardtack even harder. Seems impossible, but he's a man of surprising talents. Philosophy was a luxury for men who didn't have to face down a 50-ton behemoth with nothing but a pointy stick and a prayer. For Silas, it was about the immediate, the tangible, the things that could kill you before breakfast. The memory of young Thomas, his face pale and shocked as the icy water closed over him, flickered briefly. Silas shoved it down. No room for that. Not now. Not ever, if he could help it. He could hear the sounds of other men stirring, a symphony of coughs, grunts, curses, and the thud of bodies hitting the deck. The forecastle was slowly, painfully, coming to life, or its closest approximation. The air, if possible, grew thicker as more bodies began to move, releasing their nocturnal contributions to the general miasma. Someone near the hatchway lit a closely guarded stub of a candle, and its flickering, pathetic light cast long, dancing shadows, turning the cramped space into a Bosch painting in motion. Figures hunched and shivered, spectral and miserable. This wasn't a new day dawning. It was just the previous day, slightly colder and angrier, having another go. Silas took a deep breath, regretted it immediately as the stench hit the back of his throat, and prepared to face it. After all, the misery's price wasn't going to sail itself into icy oblivion without his help. The ascent from the forecastle into the biting reality of the main deck was like climbing out of a rank, overcrowded grave into a slightly larger, windier, and significantly colder graveyard. Silas emerged, hunched against the wind, into a world of dim gray twilight. The sun, that reluctant celestial body, was still hiding somewhere behind a thick bank of bruised-looking clouds that scudded low and fast across the sky. What little light there was seemed to seep from the turbulent gray sea itself, reflecting off the whitecaps that clawed at the sides of the misery's price. The wind. Oh, the wind. It was a living thing, a malevolent spirit of the north, armed with icy needles of sleet that it hurled with vicious accuracy at any exposed patch of skin. Silas's cheeks and nose were already burning, then numbing. His first task, after his eyes adjusted to the gloom, was to not immediately get thrown overboard by the ship's violent pitching. The misery's price was bucking like a condemned mule heading for the slaughterhouse, each roll and plunge a test of balance and sea legs. Men, dark shapes in the pre-dawn murk, moved with a practiced, stooped urgency, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows of masts and rigging. The deck was already slick with a charming combination of sea spray, condensation, and probably a bit of fish gut from yesterday's minor triumphs. Every step was a gamble. He made his way aft, past the massive brick tryworks that dominated the mid-deck, their iron cauldrons cold and empty for now, but promising future olfactory assaults. The smell up here was marginally better than the concentrated human fug of the forecastle, replaced by the cleaner, sharper scents of brine, wet wood, and the faint metallic tang of approaching snow. A positive development, if you graded on a very generous curve. Silas's station, along with the other harpooners and boat steerers, was near the whaleboats. These were the slender, clinker-built vessels, around 28 feet long, that were their primary tools of engagement, their chariots into battle. There were 3 of them nestled on the main deck, with 2 more, the waist boats, hanging from davits on the port and starboard sides, ready for quicker deployment. He ran a critical, half-frozen hand along the gunwale of his assigned boat, the Reckless Few, a name that was perhaps a little too on the nose. He checked the oars, ensuring they were properly lashed but ready, the thole pins for wear, the steering oars grommet. His cold, stiff fingers fumbled with the thick, tarred hemp of the whale line. This was the crucial bit. 200 fathoms, 1,200 feet, of meticulously coiled rope, thinner than a man's wrist, but expected to hold against the death throes of a 50-ton leviathan. It had to be perfect. A kink, a fray, a weak spot could mean a snapped line, a lost whale, or worse, a boat dragged under, or a man sliced in two. He'd seen it happen, more than once. His body protested each movement. The damp cold had settled deep into his joints. Bending to inspect the line sent daggers of pain through his lower back. His shoulders ached from years of hauling oars and flinging irons. His hands, despite the calluses, felt raw and clumsy in the frigid air. It was like trying to tie knots wearing wooden gloves. He blew on his fingers, a useless gesture as the wind immediately stole the fleeting warmth. "Blackwood, look alive, man. Or as alive as you ever managed to look." The voice belonged to Mr. Coffin, the first mate, a man whose neck was thicker than Silas's thigh and whose patience was thinner than a winter shadow. Coffin was a whirlwind of brisk, often angry efficiency, his face perpetually ruddy from the cold, and some whispered, from the liberal application of rum to his morning constitution. "Captain wants eyes in the nest soon as there's light enough to see our own doom. Get your boat crew to check their gear. And for the love of all that's unholy, make sure your new lad knows which end of the oar goes in the water." Ah, the new lad. Daniel. A boy barely old enough to shave, pale and perpetually wide-eyed, who'd been pressed into Silas's boat crew after Thomas was lost. Daniel looked like he'd be more at home in a library than on the deck of a whaler in the North Atlantic. Silas had seen his type before. They either hardened fast or broke completely. There wasn't much middle ground out here. "Aye, Mr. Coffin," Silas grunted, the words snatched away by the wind. He spotted Daniel huddled near the mainmast, looking like a seasick kitten. The boy was shivering violently, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. "Morning, lad," Silas said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Best get your wits about you. Cold like this, your brain freezes before your fingers if you ain't careful." Daniel jumped, startled. "Mr. Blackwood." "Aye, sir. Just a bit parky, ain't it?" Parky, Silas thought. That was one word for it. Another might be prelude to frostbite. "It'll get worse before it gets better. And then it'll get worse again," Silas stated, not unkindly, just factually. "Check your oar. Make sure the loom ain't cracked. And when we're called, try not to catch a crab. You'll send us all for a swim, and the only thing colder than this wind is that water." He pointed at the churning gray expanse. "She don't suffer fools gladly." The early morning was uniquely designed for misery in these latitudes. The visibility was atrocious, a shifting canvas of gray mist, sleet, and sea spray. Spotting a whale in this mess would be half luck, half miracle. The decks were treacherous, coated in a fine sheen of ice in places, demanding careful, shuffling steps. Metal fittings were cold enough to sting bare skin, a lesson most learned quickly and painfully, and everything was damp. A damp that seeped into your bones and refused to leave, making the cold feel 10 times more potent. The first crisis of the day was thankfully a minor one, though it felt major to the poor soul involved. As the crew shuffled towards the galley for whatever slop cook had concocted, a sudden violent lurch of the ship sent a young seaman, no older than Daniel, sprawling. He went down hard, his tin cup clattering across the icy deck, followed by a sharp cry of pain. He'd landed awkwardly on his wrist. Mr. Coffin was there in an instant. "Up, you clumsy oaf. What are you, a blasted ballerina? This ain't a dance floor." But even Coffin's bluster softened a fraction when he saw the angle of the man's wrist. All right. Looks like you've done yourself a mischief. To the surgeon with you." The ship's surgeon, a man whose primary qualification seemed to be a strong stomach and a large collection of saws, would likely dose him with laudanum and tell him not to be so clumsy next time. For the injured sailor, it probably meant a painful, festering recovery, or if he was lucky, a reassignment to lighter duties, which were scarce on a whaler. For the rest of the crew, it was a stark reminder. Even a simple misstep could lead to disablement, or worse. One less hand meant more work for everyone else. Breakfast, when it came, was an insult to the concept of food. A thick, grayish gruel, allegedly oatmeal but bearing a disturbing resemblance to wallpaper paste, served in dented tin bowls, and of course the hardtack. These were biscuits, or rather indestructible slabs of baked flour and water, so notoriously durable they were rumored to outlast the ships that carried them. Weevils were a common, protein-rich addition. Silas broke a corner off his biscuit, inspected it briefly for any visible life, then dunked it into the gruel, hoping to soften it enough to avoid cracking a tooth. He ate standing up, braced against the sway of the ship, the wind trying to steal the meager warmth from his bowl. Conversations were minimal, mostly grunts and mumbled curses. The pecking order was well established. The captain and his officers ate separately, in relative, and I use that term loosely, comfort. The harpooners and boat steerers, like Silas, had a certain grim status, but down here, among the common seamen, it was every man for himself, especially when it came to food, or a marginally drier spot to stand. "Heard anything from the masthead?" Silas asked a fellow harpooner, a grizzled veteran named Finn, who was attempting to gnaw his way through a biscuit with the determination of a beaver facing a particularly stubborn tree. Finn shook his head, spraying crumbs. Nothing but gray, and more gray, and a bit of that off-white gray that means ice blink to the north. Captain's still keen, though. Says his left big toe is tingling, and that always means whales. Silas snorted. More likely means gangrene at his age. It wasn't loud enough for any officers to hear. Such small rebellions were the spice of life, or at least the salt in their very bland diet. His body was already a litany of complaints. The dull ache in his back had sharpened to a steady throb. His fingers were stiff and unresponsive. Yesterday's exertions, mostly hauling lines and scrubbing decks, had left his muscles feeling like overstretched leather. And despite the pathetic amount of sleep, an insidious exhaustion was already creeping in. This wasn't the fresh, energetic start to a day. It was simply the continuation of a long, unbroken chain of toil, punctuated by brief, inadequate pauses. He could feel yesterday's fatigue clinging to him, like the smell of old blubber, a debt his body hadn't yet paid off, and already today was demanding more. A cry from above, thin and reedy against the wind, but unmistakable. "Masthead! Deck there!" Every man froze, heads tilted upwards. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Mr. Coffin bellowed, "What do you see, Mr. Starbucks?" Yes. Melville borrowed names, or perhaps names were just common. The reply was fragmented by the wind, but the key word, the one that could change everything, the one they both dreaded and desperately hoped for, was clear enough. "Blows. Thar. She. Blows. Thar. She blows." The words, even strained and ripped by the wind, had an almost magical effect on the deck of the Misery's Price. It was like someone had poked a stick into a sluggish anthill. The carefully cultivated lethargy, born of cold and resignation, vanished, replaced by a frantic, almost convulsive energy. Years of training, or perhaps just the primal urge to get the bloody job done, and maybe, just maybe, get a slightly larger share of the eventual profits, kicked in. Men who had been shuffling like arthritic ghosts moments before were now scrambling, shouting, and generally creating organized chaos. "Where away?" bellowed Captain Bunker, a man whose voice could curdle milk at 50 paces, appearing on the quarterdeck as if summoned by the whale's spout itself. He was a stout, red-faced man, wrapped in so many layers he resembled a poorly packed bale of wool. 2 points off the starboard bow. She spouts long and lazy. A biggin, Cap'n, a real biggin, came the cry from the masthead. The lookout, a young lad named Eli, sounded like his voice was about to crack with a mixture of excitement and the sheer effort of shouting over the gale. "Starboard boats, stand by to lower." Mr. Coffin, the first mate, was already roaring, his orders cutting through the general din. "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Swain, get your crews to stations. Move like you've got a fire in your trousers, not ice in your veins." Silas was already moving. The starboard boats included his, the reckless few. He didn't run. Running on this heaving, slippery deck was an invitation to a broken neck. But he moved with a speed and economy of motion that belied his aching joints. "Daniel, on your feet, lad, and try not to look like you're about to confess your sins to the fish," he barked at the greenhorn, who was staring with wide, terrified eyes at the churning sea where the whale had been sighted. The physical demands ramped up instantly. Just getting the whaleboat ready to lower was a feat of strength and coordination. The boats were heavy, and the ship was rolling aggressively. Covers had to be unlashed, oars positioned, lines checked one last frantic time. Silas's hands, already stiff, were now forced into rapid, precise movements, handling thick, unyielding ropes and cold iron. Each breath plumed white in the frigid air, a visible testament to their exertion. The environment, never exactly friendly, decided to up its game. The sun, which had been making a half-hearted attempt to pierce the oppressive gray ceiling, gave up the ghost entirely. The clouds thickened, darkening the already grim seascape. The wind, as if sensing an opportunity for maximum discomfort, howled with renewed ferocity, whipping spray off the wave crests and driving the sleet with the force of tiny daggers. The sea itself seemed to grow more agitated, the waves choppier, the troughs deeper. Visibility, already poor, worsened, making the distant spout of the whale an intermittent, teasing phantom. "Lower away! Lower away!" The order came, and with a screech of davits and shouted commands, the reckless few began its precarious descent to the water. This was always a heart-in-the-mouth moment. The boat, laden with crew, harpoons, lances, and hundreds of fathoms of line, swung wildly as the ship rolled. One clumsy move, one poorly timed wave, and they could be smashed against the hull or swamped before they even began the chase. Silas, already in his position in the bow, harpoon at the ready, gripped the gunwale, his knuckles white. He braced himself, his eyes scanning the waves, anticipating the jolt as they hit the water. They struck the surface with a jarring thud and a splash of icy water that drenched everyone to the bone. Instantly, the true cold of the North Atlantic bit into them. If they weren't awake before, they were now. "Shove off! Oars out! Give way, men! Give way together!" shouted Mr. Baxter, the boat's officer, a nervous man with a twitchy mustache who was currently steering. And then, the rowing began. Oh, the rowing. If there was a special circle of hell reserved for whalers, it probably involved an eternity of rowing in a leaky boat against a headwind, in freezing conditions, chasing a creature that clearly wanted nothing to do with them. Each man pulled on his heavy 20-foot oar, their bodies straining in unison, or at least that was the theory. Silas in the bow wasn't rowing at this stage. His job was to watch for the whale, to guide them, to be ready with the iron. But he could hear the grunts and strained breathing behind him. He could feel the boat lurch and shudder with each stroke. This is where the mistake happened. It wasn't a catastrophic mistake, not yet. But it was the kind of small, stupid error born of inexperience and terror that could easily snowball. Daniel, the greenhorn, seated at the least crucial but still important after oar, was clearly struggling. His oar strokes were uneven, sometimes digging too deep, sometimes barely skimming the surface. He was visibly shaking, whether from cold or fear, Silas couldn't tell. Probably both. "Mind your stroke, Daniel," Baxter yelped, his voice tight with anxiety. "You're catching crabs like we're fishing for supper." Catching a crab, letting the oar get trapped by the water, could throw off the rhythm of the entire boat, or worse, send the rower flying off his thwart. Then it happened. A larger wave than usual caught Daniel's oar at an awkward angle. Instead of pulling through it, he panicked, his grip faltering. The oar twisted violently in his hands, the butt end smacking him hard in the chest and sending him tumbling backward off his seat, legs flailing. The oar, now a loose cannon, thrashed wildly, narrowly missing the head of the man in front of him. The boat slewed sideways, losing precious momentum, and shipped a good quantity of icy water. "Blast and damnation, boy," roared Baxter, his face purpling. "Get that oar back in. Are you trying to drown us all before we even see the beast?" The other men cursed, their own rhythm broken, their already miserable state compounded by a dousing of near-freezing seawater. Daniel, sputtering and soaked, scrambled back onto his thwart, his face a mask of shame and terror. He fumbled for the oar, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Silas, though his primary focus was ahead, had seen the whole thing. He bit back a curse. There was no time for recriminations now. "Steady, lad," he called out, his voice surprisingly calm amidst the chaos. "Breathe. Watch the man in front. Just follow his stroke. We ain't sunk yet." A small lie, perhaps. They certainly felt like they were sinking into a deeper level of misery. The whale, meanwhile, was proving to be a fickle quarry. It would surface, blow a few times, great, tantalizing plumes of mist, then sound, disappearing for agonizingly long stretches. Each time it resurfaced, it seemed to be further away, or in a slightly different direction. The chase became a grim game of cat and mouse, if the mouse was the size of a small cottage, and the cat was in a very leaky, very cold bathtub. The competition wasn't against other whale ships today. They were alone in this particular patch of icy hell. The conflict was more elemental. Man versus whale, man versus the sea, man versus his own failing body and faltering resolve. And sometimes, man versus his own crewmates when frustration boiled over. After Daniel's mishap, the atmosphere in the reckless few was thick with unspoken resentment. Every splash of cold water, every gust of wind, every aching muscle seemed to be amplified by the incident. The physical demands were relentless. The men rowed, their muscles screaming, their lungs burning in the frigid air. The cold spray froze on their clothes, encasing them in stiff, icy armor. Their hands, raw and blistered despite calluses, ached with every pull. Silas, though not rowing, was equally exposed, standing in the precarious bow, constantly scanning the turbulent water, the harpoon shaft cold and heavy in his grip. His feet were numb. His face felt like a frozen mask, and the wind seemed to intent on scouring the very thoughts from his head. Then came the false promise. After what felt like an eternity of fruitless, back-breaking pursuit, the whale surfaced not 200 yards ahead of them. It was a monstrous Greenland right, its broad black back arching slowly out of the water, its twin blowholes erupting in a great misty sigh. It lay on the surface, seemingly oblivious to their approach. "Easy now, men. Easy," Baxter whispered, his voice hoarse with excitement. "He's lolling. He's ours. Pull steady now, steady." A flicker of something that might have been hope, or perhaps just grim anticipation, ran through the boat. This was it. After all the cold, the misery, the near drowning of the greenhorn, their moment was at hand. The men pulled with renewed, if desperate, vigor. The boat surged forward, closing the distance. Silas braced himself, judging the range, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline, a cold fire in his veins that momentarily chased away the chill. He could see the barnacles on the whale's immense hide, the deep furrows around its eye. Closer. Closer. And then, as if sensing their unholy intentions, or perhaps just bored with its nap, the whale gave a leisurely flick of its enormous flukes, a gesture of almost contemptuous dismissal. The massive tail rose, hung suspended for a heart-stopping moment against the gray sky, then slid silently beneath the waves, leaving behind nothing but a swirling vortex of disturbed water. It was gone, vanished, as if it had never been. A collective groan, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair escaped the crew of the reckless few. Even Baxter seemed to deflate, his twitchy mustache drooping. All that effort, all that freezing, bone-jarring labor, for nothing. The whale had simply decided to dive deep, to go where they could not follow. Damn its black heart to the deepest pit, Baxter finally choked out, slamming a fist against the gunwale. Damn it all. Silas said nothing. He lowered his harpoon slightly, the anticipation draining out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and even colder than before. He'd seen this happen countless times. Whales were not stupid. They were survivors. And today, this one had decided to survive a little longer, at their expense. The brief promise of action, of a kill, of the grim satisfaction of their trade, had been snatched away, replaced by the bitter taste of failure and the dawning realization that the morning's grind had just been a warm-up. The sun, or what passed for it, was now notionally higher, meaning they were well into the late morning, and all they had to show for it were aching bodies, frayed tempers, and a boatload of wet, miserable men. The grind was indeed intensifying, just not in the way they'd hoped. The hours that followed the whale's disdainful departure were a special kind of purgatory. They didn't return to the misery's price immediately. Captain Bunker, a man whose optimism was directly proportional to his distance from the actual pointy end of a harpoon, signaled for them to continue the search. So, they rowed, and rowed, and rowed. The sea, a vast, unforgiving expanse of choppy gray, offered up nothing but more waves, more wind, and more soul-crushing monotony. The brief surge of adrenaline from the near encounter had long since dissipated, leaving behind a residue of bitter disappointment and an even deeper layer of fatigue. Midday arrived, not with a burst of cheering sunshine, but with a subtle, malicious intensification of all the existing miseries. The weak, watery light that had earlier pretended to be day achieved its zenith. A pathetic glare that reflected harshly off the restless water, making it difficult to scan the waves for any sign of life. It wasn't a warming light. It was an exposing one, highlighting the grime on their clothes, the exhaustion etched on their faces, and the sheer bleak emptiness of their surroundings. The wind, which had been merely biting, now seemed to carry shards of jagged ice, relentless and inescapable. Sleet turned to a stinging wet snow that didn't so much fall as hurl itself horizontally, finding every gap in their sodden clothing. The temperature, Silas guessed, hovered just a few degrees above freezing, but with the wind chill, it felt like being flayed by an invisible, icy razor. Their world was a monochrome canvas of gray and white, oppressive and utterly devoid of comfort. The boat, the reckless few, was an insignificant speck of human endeavor in a vast, indifferent, and actively hostile wilderness. If they got to eat, and that was a very big if, when actively hunting, the concept of a meal was a cruel joke. On this particular day of fruitless searching, Mr. Baxter, perhaps sensing the mutinous despair simmering in his crew, reluctantly declared a brief respite. This didn't mean a warm fire and a hearty stew. It meant each man fumbled within his sodden garments for whatever pathetic morsel he'd squirreled away. For Silas, it was half a biscuit, harder than a ship captain's heart, and a small, greasy piece of salt pork, so tough it felt like chewing on a leather boot sole. He ate with numb fingers, huddled against the biting wind, the boat rocking violently beneath him. The water in their small cask was brackish and tasted faintly of the wood it was stored in, but it was wet. He took a miserly sip. There was no rest, no shelter, just a few moments to choke down some calories that would barely begin to replace what they were expending. Around him, the other men did the same, their faces grim, their jaws working mechanically. Young Daniel looked like he might weep into his biscuit. Anything? Silas grunted to Finn, whose boat was a little way off, a ghostly shape in the driving snow. They had been signaled to stay relatively close. Finn's voice came back, faint and hoarse. Saw a patch of krill. The blasted things are eating better than we are. Just as the last vestiges of hope were freezing solid in their chests, a shout, weak but distinct, came from Finn's boat. Blow! Dead ahead! Close! By God, it's close! This time there was no mistaking it. Not a quarter mile off their bow, a massive black form erupted from the churning sea, sending a plume of vapor high into the sleet-filled air. It was another Greenland right, and this one looked enormous, even bigger than the one that had given them the slip earlier, and it was heading almost directly towards them, seemingly oblivious. Heave to it, lads, Baxter screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and elation. He's coming to us. He's practically offering himself up for the irons. Don't let this one get away. The exhaustion, the cold, the despair, all were momentarily forgotten, or rather, shoved aside by a fresh, potent wave of adrenaline. This was it. This was the worst task, the job everyone dreaded, yet was the entire reason for their miserable existence. The harpooning and killing of a whale. Silas was already at his post in the bow, the harpoon, a 30-pound length of iron-tipped wood, feeling like an extension of his own arm. The boat surged forward, the men pulling with a desperate, frantic energy. The whale, a black mountain of flesh, loomed larger and larger. Silas could see the callosities on its head, the bonnet, looking like a grotesque rocky outcrop. He could smell its breath, a strange, fishy, not entirely unpleasant odor that was unique to these giants. Easy now. Easy, Baxter hissed as they closed the last few boat lengths. The noise of their oars, the creak of the thole pins, even their ragged breathing, seemed deafeningly loud in the sudden tense silence. The whale was still placid, its small eye set deep in its immense head, seemingly unaware of the tiny, deadly insect approaching. Stand up, Silas, Baxter commanded, his voice tight. Silas rose, balancing precariously in the pitching bow. The deck of the small boat was slick with ice and spray. One wrong move and he'd be in the water, an appetizer for the main course. He raised the harpoon, its twin flukes sharp and menacing. This was the moment. All his years of experience, all the instincts honed by countless hunts, focused into this single lethal point. He had to hit it just right, behind the massive head, deep into the vital organs, or at least deep enough for the barbs to hold. Now, Silas, now, give it to him. With a grunt that tore from his very core, Silas lunged, putting all his weight, all his strength, all his desperate hope for a quick end to this misery, into the throw. The harpoon flew true, a dark streak against the gray sky. It struck the whale with a sickening, fleshy thud, sinking deep into the black blubber just behind the massive blowhole. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The whale seemed to merely shudder. And then all hell broke loose. The creature erupted. It wasn't a sound of pain, more like an explosion of pure titanic power. With a movement too fast for the eye to truly follow, the whale arched its back, its immense flukes rising from the water and crashing down with a sound like a cannonball hitting a cathedral. A wall of icy water and spray smashed over the reckless few, blinding them, drenching them, nearly swamping the boat. "Hang on," Silas roared, grabbing the gunwale as the whale line attached to his harpoon screamed out of the tubs in the center of the boat, smoking as it ran through the chocks in the bow. This was the Nantucket sleigh ride, and it was every bit as terrifying as the legends claimed. The whale, now a raging black demon, took off, towing the whaleboat behind it at an impossible speed. The small vessel skimmed and bounced across the violent waves, sometimes becoming airborne, threatening to capsize with every terrifying lurch. The men could only hold on for dear life, their knuckles white, their faces frozen in masks of grim determination or outright terror. Water poured in over the sides. Young Daniel was openly weeping. Though whether from fear or the stinging spray, it was hard to tell. Silas's body was a symphony of agony. His arms, shoulders, and back screamed from the effort of the throw and the constant bracing. His grip on the gunwale was failing, his fingers numb and clumsy. His vision swam with the violent motion and the relentless spray. He could feel the boat groaning and creaking under the strain, threatening to splinter into 1,000 pieces. This was where men died. This was where a single mistake, a moment of panic, meant a cold, dark end. The whale surged, then sounded, diving deep, pulling the bow of the boat dangerously down towards the water. "Line! Check the line!" Baxter shrieked, his face ashen. If the line snagged, if they couldn't pay it out fast enough, they'd be dragged under. One of the men, a veteran named Jeb, frantically tended the smoking rope, his hands wrapped in thick leather nippers to prevent them from being burned to the bone by the friction. Then, just as suddenly, the whale resurfaced, breaching halfway out of the water in a colossal display of power and fury, before crashing back down, sending another tsunami over them. It thrashed its head from side to side, trying to dislodge the agonizing iron. Blood, thick and dark, began to stain the water around it, a stark crimson against the gray. This was the midday incident, a chaotic, life-or-death struggle against a creature many times their size, in an environment determined to kill them all. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than an hour, they were dragged, battered, and terrorized. Silas, despite the pain and the cold, had to remain focused. His job wasn't over. The harpoon was just the first insult. Now came the lances. When the whale finally began to tire, its rushes becoming shorter, its breathing more ragged, Baxter gave the order. Pull in line, get us closer. Lances ready." This was, if possible, even more dangerous. They had to haul the boat, hand over agonizing hand, closer to the still dangerous, thrashing behemoth. Silas and another experienced boatman, armed with long, sharp lances, had to get close enough to pierce the whale's lungs. It was brutal, bloody work, a dance of death in the freezing water. Each time they got close, the whale would roll or thrash its tail, threatening to crush them. Silas, his strength waning, his body a mass of screaming nerves, found a reserve he didn't know he possessed. He thrust the lance deep, again and again, feeling the resistance of blubber and muscle, then the sickening give as it found its mark. The whale shuddered violently. More blood. So much blood. The sea around them turned into a crimson slaughterhouse. Finally, with a sound like a giant tormented sigh, the whale went into its flurry. It began to swim in a tightening circle, thrashing its flukes, its jaw agape, spouting not mist, but thick gouts of blood that painted the boat and the men in a gruesome, sticky veneer. This was the death throw. It was a horrifying, awe-inspiring, and deeply unsettling sight. Even the most hardened whalers watched in grim silence as the life drained from the magnificent beast. Then it was over. The whale rolled onto its side, its great eye staring blankly at the turbulent sky. A vast stillness descended, broken only by the slap of waves against the boat and the ragged, exhausted breathing of the men. They had won, or at least they had survived. For now. Silas slumped against the gunwale, his muscles twitching, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His vision was blurry, black spots dancing before his eyes. He felt a cold dread seep into him, colder even than the water that filled their boots. He had done this countless times, but each kill took something from him, a small piece of his soul chipped away by the brutality of it all. Looking at the massive, lifeless form beside them, he felt not triumph, but a profound, weary emptiness. The peak of suffering had been reached, but the day, he knew, was far, far from over. Now came the truly disgusting part. The brief, almost stunned stillness that followed the whale's death flurry was just the universe catching its breath before delivering the next round of misery. There was no time for congratulations, no moment of quiet reflection on the titanic struggle they'd just endured. There was only the whale, a floating mountain of rapidly cooling flesh, blubber and bone, and the grim, unavoidable task of turning it into something that might eventually, someday, translate into a few miserable coins in their pockets. All right, you pitiful excuses for seamen. The voice of Mr. Coffin, the first mate, boomed across the blood-stained water from the deck of the Misery's Price, which had been slowly making its way towards them during the fight. Stop gawping like lovesick calves and secure that beast. We ain't got all winter, though at this rate, we bloody well might. Securing the whale was the first act in a long, tedious, and utterly disgusting play. It involved maneuvering their small, battered whaleboat alongside the colossal carcass, then passing heavy chains and ropes around its flukes and head. This was dangerous work. The dead whale, while no longer actively trying to kill them, was still an unpredictable mass. It rolled sluggishly in the rough seas, threatening to crush the fragile boat or trap a limb. The water was a hideous soup of blood, oil, and bits of whale tissue, and the stench, already formidable, began to take on new, complex layers of foulness as the animal's internal processes shut down. Silas, along with the others, worked with a grim, mechanical efficiency. His muscles screamed in protest with every pull on a heavy, saturated rope. His hands, already raw, were now slick with whale blood and slime, making his grip treacherous. The cold was a constant gnawing presence, but now it was overlaid with the peculiar sticky chill of being soaked in the bodily fluids of a recently deceased cetacean. It was an experience he wouldn't recommend, not even to his worst enemy. Maybe to Captain Bunker, on a particularly bad day. Once the whale was chained to the Misery's Price, the real fun began. The process known as cutting in. This was where the whalers, armed with razor-sharp, long-handled cutting spades, leaned precariously from platforms slung over the side of the ship or directly from the whale's back itself to strip away the blubber. It was like peeling a monstrous, oily fruit. If the fruit weighed 50 tons and smelled like a fish market that had been abandoned for a month in the summer heat, the afternoon dissolved into a mind-numbing, repetitive grind. Silas found himself on one of the cutting stages, a flimsy wooden platform suspended by ropes, hanging just above the thrashing, bloodied waves and the side of the whale. His job was to wield a cutting spade, a heavy tool with a blade like a giant razor. With each roll of the ship and the carcass, he had to lean out, find his purchase on the slippery blubber, and make deep, precise cuts. Then, massive hooks attached to blocks and tackles creaking from the ship's masts would tear away the huge, blanket pieces of blubber, sometimes 10 to 15 feet long and several feet thick. The monotony was soul-destroying. Slice, hook, haul, slice, hook, haul. The rhythm was broken only by the shouts of the officers, the groan of the tackles, the sickening tearing sound as blubber parted from muscle, and the occasional splash as someone lost their footing or a tool. the deck of the Misery's Price became a nightmarish landscape. Huge, steaming chunks of blubber were piled everywhere, their undersides a shocking bloody red, their outer surfaces a glistening oily black. The scuppers ran continuously, not with water, but with a vile mixture of oil, blood, and seawater, staining the sides of the ship in grotesque, greasy streaks. Walking on deck was like navigating an ice rink designed by a lunatic butcher. Men slipped, cursed, and struggled to keep their footing amidst the carnage. As the hours wore on, Silas's mind began to wander, a dangerous luxury in this line of work. The repetitive motions, the overwhelming stench, the sheer exhaustion, it all conspired to dull the senses and cloud the judgment. He found himself thinking of absurd things, the taste of his wife Martha's apple pie, something he hadn't experienced in nearly 3 years, the way young Thomas used to whistle, slightly off-key, while mending nets, the exact shade of green on a particular patch of moss he'd seen on a rock back in Nantucket during his last brief spell ashore. These fleeting images were like tiny, fragile bubbles in a sea of gore and misery. He nearly paid a heavy price for one such mental excursion. He was leaning out, spade extended, vaguely wondering if the rats in the forecastle preferred blubber to hardtack, when the ship gave an unexpected lurch. The whale carcass rolled beneath him, and his footing, already precarious on the greasy platform, vanished. For a heart-stopping moment, he was airborne, the gray, bloody water rushing up to meet him. He flailed, dropping his spade, and managed to grab onto one of the ropes holding the platform, his body slamming hard against the rough hull of the ship. His arms screamed as they took his full weight. Blackwood, wake up, damn you. Mr. Coffin's enraged bellow cut through his daze. Are you trying to feed the sharks before they've even had a proper invitation? Sharks, of course. Where there was a dead whale, there were sharks. Silas hadn't seen them yet, but he knew they'd be gathering, drawn by the miles-long slick of blood and oil. Falling into that water would be a particularly unpleasant way to go. He hauled himself back onto the platform, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands shaking more from the adrenaline than the cold. The near miss sharpened his focus for a while. The image of dark fins circling in the crimson water, a potent motivator. He saw another man, less lucky, slip from the whale's back and go under, only to be hauled out sputtering and terrified, minus a boot and a good deal of his courage. The afternoon crisis wasn't a single dramatic event, but rather a series of grinding cumulative failures. A block in one of the main tackles, stressed beyond its limits by a particularly heavy piece of blubber, suddenly shattered, sending splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. The massive hook and the blubber piece it was holding crashed back onto the carcass, narrowly missing one of the cutting gangs. Miraculously, no one was seriously injured, but the delay was considerable as a new tackle had to be rigged, all while the men shivered and cursed in the relentless wind. Tempers, already frayed, grew shorter. 2 men got into a vicious, snarling argument over a misplaced flensing knife, their faces contorted with rage and exhaustion, until Mr. Baxter waded in and separated them with a rope's end. Yet, even in this maelstrom of blood, guts, and misery, there were fleeting, almost invisible human moments. Silas saw Daniel, the greenhorn, who was now tasked with the unenviable job of manhandling slippery blubber chunks across the deck, actually manage a grim smile when an older sailor, Finn, showed him a trick to get a better grip using a small wooden toggle. It was a tiny gesture, a shared moment of practical knowledge in the midst of chaos, but it was something. Later, as they struggled to hoist a particularly unwieldy piece, Silas found himself working alongside Jan, the hulking Dutchman from his bunk area. For a moment, their eyes met over the greasy mass, and Jan grunted what might have been a syllable of encouragement, or perhaps just a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity of their predicament. It was hard to tell with Jan. Humor, like warmth, was a rare commodity. Time itself seemed to warp. The sun, A pale smear in the gray sky seemed to hang motionless, refusing to begin its descent. Each task, each cut, each haul felt like it stretched for an eternity. Yet paradoxically, the hours also seemed to race by in a blur of exhausting labor. One moment it was midday. The next, the light was already beginning to fade, and they were still only halfway through stripping the massive carcass. The sheer scale of the whale was daunting. It was as if they were trying to dismantle a small island made of flesh and oil. The physical toll was immense. Silas's back was a solid column of fire. His arms felt like lead weights, his shoulders dislocated. His fingers, despite the calluses, were split and bleeding, the salt and oil stinging in the raw wounds. Every so often, a wave of dizziness would wash over him, and he'd have to pause, leaning on his spade, waiting for the world to stop spinning. He was beyond tired. He was entering a state of waking hibernation, his body functioning on some primal reserve of will that he didn't even know he possessed. The 80% misery was in full effect, a suffocating blanket. The 20% positive? Perhaps it was the thought that every chunk of blubber they processed was one chunk closer to, well, to more work, but eventually, to this day ending. Or maybe it was the dark, unspoken camaraderie of shared suffering. They were all in this floating hell together. And that, in a twisted way, was a sliver of something not entirely negative. But mostly, it was just a whole lot of suck. The sun, if it could even be called that in this perpetually overcast hellscape, had finally given up its pathetic attempt to illuminate the North Atlantic. It bled out somewhere beyond the western horizon, a smear of dirty orange and bruised purple that offered no warmth, only a melancholic signal that the day, by any civilized measure, should be ending. But civilization was a distant rumor on the deck of the Misery's Price. Here, the dying light didn't mean respite. It meant new dangers, fresh urgency, and the dawning soul-crushing realization that their labor was far from over. As the gloom deepened, the scene on deck took on an even more infernal quality. The remaining light cast long, grotesque shadows, turning the heaps of blubber into glistening dark mounds and the weary, blood-soaked men into demonic figures moving through a charnel house. The primary task of cutting in, stripping the last of the blubber from the whale's carcass, became a frantic race against the encroaching darkness. Every movement was now fraught with increased peril. Sharp, cutting spades, already dangerous in full daylight, became lethal in the shifting shadows. A misplaced step on the greasy, cluttered deck could easily mean a broken ankle or a tumble into the icy, shark-infested water that still churned with the remnants of the whale. "Bear a hand, you sluggards." Mr. Coffin's voice, raw and strained from a full day of bellowing, still managed to convey a potent threat. "We lose the light, we lose the blubber, and any man responsible for losing good oil will answer to me, and then to the captain." The unspoken part of that threat was that answering to Captain Bunker usually involved a rope's end or worse. This was the evening push, a period of heightened desperation. Exhaustion was no longer a creeping fatigue. It was a heavy shroud smothering every man. Muscles, pushed far beyond their limits, screamed with every movement. Eyes, strained from hours of peering at the bloody mess in dim light, burned and watered. Tempers, already worn thin, were now non-existent. Grunts and curses were the primary form of communication. It was a fertile ground for accidents. And an accident, of course, duly arrived. They were hoisting one of the last massive blanket pieces of blubber. The men on the capstan, their bodies slick with sweat despite the biting cold, strained to turn the heavy bars. Silas was part of a group on deck, trying to guide the swinging, slippery mass towards the hatch that led to the blubber room below decks. The ship gave a particularly violent roll. The blubber piece, weighing easily a ton, swung wildly. A young sailor, his face a pale smudge in the twilight, misjudged its momentum. He tried to dodge, but his feet slipped on a patch of bloody ice. "Look out!" someone screamed, but it was too late. The massive slab of blubber caught the sailor with a sickening thud, Not a direct hit, but a glancing blow that sent him spinning. He crashed hard against the bulwark, his head connecting with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the deck like a discarded puppet, a dark stain blooming on the wood beneath his head. For a moment, everyone froze. The only sounds were the groan of the ship's timbers, the eternal howl of the wind, and the rhythmic slosh of oily water in the scuppers. Mr. Baxter was the first to move, rushing to the fallen man's side. He knelt, then looked up, his face grim in the fading light. "He's alive," he announced, his voice flat. But his head split. "Get him to the surgeon. The rest of you, secure that blubber. We're not done here." The incident cast a fresh pall over the already grim proceedings. The injured man was carried below, his groans fading into the general cacophony of the ship. There was no time to dwell on it. The work had to continue. The whale, or what was left of it, a stripped, bloody skeleton already attracting more aggressive attention from the circling sharks, had to be dealt with. As the last of the usable blubber was hacked and hauled aboard, a new, dreadful realization began to dawn on the utterly spent crew. They weren't stopping. The sunset hadn't brought an end to their torment. If anything, it heralded a new phase. The cutting in was largely complete, but now the trying out would begin in earnest. This was the process of rendering the blubber into oil in the massive iron trypots situated mid-deck. A collective, unspoken groan seemed to emanate from the very souls of the men. Many had secretly harbored a desperate, foolish hope that once the whale was flensed, they might be granted a few hours of respite. The sight of Mr. Grimshaw, the boatswain, already directing men to feed the first chunks of blubber into the trypots and stoke the fires beneath them, crushed that hope with brutal efficiency. The fires, already lit, cast a hellish flickering orange glow across the deck, illuminating the exhausted, blood-spattered faces of the crew and the greasy, chaotic mess that surrounded them. Acrid black smoke began to billow from the crude chimneys, carrying the stench of burning fat and singed flesh across the already foul air. This wasn't the end of the day. It was the beginning of a long, stinking night. If there had been a journey back to sleeping quarters, it would have been an agonizing trudge. But for many, including Silas, there was no such journey yet. While some of the crew were finally released to collapse into their bunks, those assigned to the try-works or to continue clearing the decks had to soldier on. Silas, his original role as harpooner now a distant memory of the morning's relative simplicity, found himself tasked with forking chunks of blubber into a wooden tub, ready to be minced for the pots. His hands were so stiff and swollen he could barely grip the heavy, long-tined fork. Each movement sent jolts of pain through his arms and back. He felt like a walking corpse, animated only by the fear of the mate's boot. Evening interactions, such as they were, took place in this fiery, smoky hellscape. Conversations were brief, disjointed, and often delirious. Men muttered to themselves or to the bloody chunks of blubber they were handling. Young Daniel, his face pale and streaked with soot and oil, was working near Silas, his movements slow and clumsy, his eyes wide with a kind of shell-shocked horror. Never seen anything like it," Daniel mumbled, more to himself than to Silas, as he tried to spear a particularly slippery piece of blubber. It slithered away from him like a live thing. The blood, the smell. Silas grunted, not bothering to look up. "Get used to it, lad, or die trying. Those are pretty much your choices out here." There was no malice in his voice, just the flat, weary truth. What was the point of sugarcoating it? The sea didn't do niceties. A little later, Finn, his face barely visible through a coating of grime, stumbled past, carrying a bucket of gurry, the foul, unusable dregs from the trypots, to heave over the side. "Heard the captain's talking about another hunt tomorrow if the weather holds," he croaked, his voice raspy from the smoke. Silas just shook his head. The thought of doing this all again in a few hours was too horrific to contemplate. Weather won't hold, he predicted, more from desperate hope than meteorological expertise. This wind's got teeth, and it's not done biting. The camaraderie, if you could call it that, was born of shared, abject misery. A brief, pain-filled glance exchanged with another man as you both recoiled from a particularly noxious cloud of smoke. A muttered curse in unison as a wave washed over the deck, soaking already sodden boots. These were the tiny, almost imperceptible threads that bound them together in their suffering. There was a strange, almost hysterical edge to some of the interactions now. One man near the trypots started singing a bawdy, completely inappropriate shanty, his voice cracking, until Mr. Grimshaw silenced him with a roar. Another just stood and stared into the flames, a blank, empty look in his eyes, until he was roughly shaken back to the task at hand. The light from the Tryworks fires painted a scene worthy of Dante. Men, their faces blackened and slick with grease, moved like tortured souls through the smoke and steam, their tools glinting in the demonic light. The smell was indescribable, a thick, choking combination of burning fat, old blood, stale seawater, and human sweat, so potent it made the eyes water and the stomach churn. Silas imagined this was what the very air in hell must smell like. The misery's price was well named tonight. It was a floating cauldron of torment, and they were the ingredients. The false hope of an end had been thoroughly extinguished, replaced by the grim certainty of a long, arduous night. The night deepened, but the activity on the misery's price did not cease. It merely shifted its infernal focus. The hellish glow of the Tryworks pulsed at the heart of the ship, casting flickering demonic shadows that danced across the ice-slicked, grease-coated decks. Acrid smoke, thick with the stench of burning blubber and singed bone, billowed into the freezing air, a suffocating miasma that stung the eyes and clawed at the throat. For those like Silas, not immediately on duty at the roaring fires, there was a brief, grudging allowance for what the officers laughably termed rest and sustenance. It was an illusion, of course, a cruel parody of human needs. The evening meal, for those fortunate enough to be momentarily relieved from the direct assault of the Tryworks, was an experience in swift, joyless refueling. It was served near the galley, a small, smoke-blackened hutch, where Cook, a man whose culinary philosophy seemed to be based on the principle that food was a punishment, ladled out a tepid, greasy slop into whatever battered tin cup or bowl a man could present. Tonight's offering was duff, a dense boiled pudding of flour, water, and a few suspicious-looking lumps of salt beef, all swimming in a thin, oily liquid that might once have aspired to be broth. It was heavy, mostly tasteless, and sat in the stomach like a cannonball. Alongside it, the inevitable hardtack, possibly softened slightly by the steam and general dampness of the ship, though softened was a very relative term. Silas received his portion and retreated to a slightly less chaotic corner of the deck near the bundled spare sails to consume it. His entire body throbbed with a deep, resonant ache. He was too tired to chew properly, his jaw muscles protesting with every movement. He ate mechanically, forcing the dense food down, not for pleasure, but for the faint hope of generating enough energy to survive the next shift. Around him, other men did the same, their faces blackened by soot, their eyes hollow in the flickering firelight. There was little conversation, just the slurping of spoons, the occasional choked cough as smoke caught a throat, and the rhythmic creak and groan of the ship. Social dynamics around food were, as always, stark and primal. Men ate quickly, guarding their meager portions with a feral intensity. Sharing was rare, reserved for only the closest bonds or a debt owed. Hoarding, if one could find anything worth hoarding that the rats wouldn't get to first, was a constant, whispered accusation. Stealing, if caught, was met with swift and brutal punishment. Tonight, however, most men were too exhausted for anything beyond the immediate, desperate need to ingest calories. Young Daniel, Silas noted, was struggling to keep his duff down, his face a pale green in the orange glow. An older sailor, noticing the lad's distress, gruffly pushed a slightly less weevil-ridden piece of his own hardtack towards him. "Soak it in what's left of your swill, boy. Goes down easier," he muttered, before turning back to his own meal. A fleeting moment of rough compassion in the otherwise brutal landscape. Once the pathetic excuse for a meal was choked down, the next futile ritual was bodily maintenance. Cleaning was a laughable concept. Water, fresh or salt, was too precious or too cold for washing. Silas ran a greasy hand over his face, succeeding only in smearing the soot and blood into a more uniform layer of grime. His clothes were stiff with dried gore, salt, and oil. He knew he stank. They all stank. It was the perfume of their profession. His hands were a mess. The cold, the constant friction of ropes and tools, and the corrosive whale oil had left them cracked, blistered, and bleeding. He had a few particularly nasty gashes from the flensing spade. He grimaced as he poked at one, the raw flesh stinging fiercely. There was a communal pot of slush, the foulest, lowest-grade oil skimmed from the try-pots, sometimes mixed with tar, that some men used as a crude salve. It was said to keep out the water, though it probably sealed in more dirt than it kept out. Silas reluctantly dipped his fingers into the vile concoction and smeared it over the worst of his wounds. It stung like fire, then settled into a dull throb. It probably wouldn't do much good, but doing something, anything, felt marginally better than doing nothing. He checked the lashings on his sheath knife. It was still secure. His spare harpoon head, which he kept wrapped in an oily rag, seemed intact. There wasn't much else in the way of personal equipment to maintain. His life depended more on the ship's gear, and that was the responsibility of the mates, a thought that wasn't entirely comforting given the recent tackle failure. The forecastle, when he finally stumbled towards it, was a vision of hell. It was even more crowded than usual, as men from the relieved watch tried to find space to collapse. The air, already thick, was now zusätzlich, additionally, choked with the oily smoke from the try-works that seeped down through the hatch and every crack in the deck. It was warmer than outside, but it was a suffocating, unhealthy warmth, like being trapped in a poorly ventilated abattoir that was also on fire. Social time in this pit of despair was brief and grim. Men lay in their narrow bunks, groaning, coughing, or staring blankly at the blackened deck beams above. Some muttered in their sleep, reliving the horrors of the day. Gallows humor was the prevailing currency. "Heard cook's planning a real treat for breakfast," one man croaked from the darkness. "Says he found a new way to burn the oatmeal. Calls it double scorched surprise." A weak chuckle rippled through the nearby bunks. "Surprises you live through it," another voice added. Someone was definitely sick. A racking, wet cough echoed from a far corner, a sound that spoke of lungs giving up the fight. Scurvy was always a threat on these long voyages, its telltale signs: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, old wounds reopening, whispered about in hushed tones. Anger, too, simmered just below the surface. A muffled argument broke out between two men over a disputed patch of bunk space, ending with a dull thud and a string of hissed curses. Yet even here, amidst the filth, the sickness, and the simmering resentment, there were faint glimmers of human connection. A shared swig of illicitly hoarded rum passed in the dark, a whispered word of encouragement, to a man clearly at the end of his tether. The simple fact of enduring this together, of knowing that every other man in this stinking hole was suffering just as much, created a perverse kind of bond. Silas didn't even attempt any pre-sleep rituals beyond kicking off his still damp boots and pulling his thin, lice-ridden blanket up to his chin. Comfort was a distant, almost forgotten concept. He lay on his hard shelf, the wood digging into his aching back and hips. The family of woodlice he suspected lived under his bunk seemed particularly active tonight. Or perhaps his skin was just more sensitive. He closed his eyes, but sleep was a coy and elusive mistress. His body screamed for rest, but his mind, supercharged with exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline of the day's violence, refused to quiet. The images kept replaying. The whale's death flurry, the blood in the water, the look on young Daniel's face, the man falling, the swing of the blubber. The sounds echoed in his ears, the roar of the try-works, the shriek of the wind, the creak of the ship, the coughing of the dying man in the corner. Every nerve ending seemed to be on fire. The pain from his lacerated hands throbbed in time with the pulse in his temples. His back felt like it was locked in a vice. The cold still seemed to radiate from his very bones, despite the suffocating warmth of the forecastle. He could feel the ship's constant jarring motion, each lurch sending a fresh wave of nausea through him. Anxiety, a familiar bedfellow, whispered insidious doubts. Would he be strong enough for tomorrow? Would his luck finally run out? Would he end up like Thomas, a fleeting memory in the icy depths? Or like the man with the split head, another piece of human refuse to be patched up or discarded? He tried to control his breathing, to find that quiet place in his mind that sometimes allowed him to drift off. But the environmental disruptions were relentless. The stench of burning oil was overpowering, making each breath an effort. Someone nearby was having a violent nightmare, thrashing and crying out. The rats, emboldened by the darkness and the smell of food and death, scurried across the deck, their tiny claws clicking. And always, the pervasive, bone-jarring groan and shudder of the misery's price as it shouldered its way through the black, unforgiving sea. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. He was trapped in a liminal state, too exhausted to be truly awake, too tormented by pain and noise to find the oblivion of sleep. He might have dozed off for a few moments here and there, brief, nightmarish snatches of unconsciousness, filled with thrashing tails and bottomless pits of blood. But it wasn't rest. It was just a deeper layer of suffering. Finally, as the faintest hint of a change in the quality of darkness suggested that another equally wretched day was not far off, Silas found himself staring into the oppressive gloom, a profound sense of resignation settling over him. Sleep was a luxury the misery's price was not inclined to grant. He was just a cog in its relentless oil-producing machine, and cogs didn't need rest. They just needed to keep turning until they broke, and then they'd be replaced. He closed his eyes again, not in hope of sleep, but simply to shut out the grim reality for a few more moments. So, there you have it. One day. One brutally, soul-crushingly long day in the life of Silas Blackwood, a 17th century harpooner aboard the good ship, the Misery's Price. And if you're thinking, well, that was uniquely awful, surely an outlier, I've got some disappointing news for you. Silas wasn't special, not in his suffering anyway. He was just one anonymous face in a vast, shivering, grease-stained army of misery that stretched across the icy oceans for centuries. Trying to pin down exact numbers for how many men toiled and died in the whaling fleets of the 17th and 18th centuries is like trying to count snowflakes in a blizzard. Historians give us estimates, but the records are often as murky as the bilgewater Silas was so fond of. We're talking tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, over the decades. Ships like the Misery's Price typically carried crews of 30 to 50 men. Multiply that by the hundreds of whaling vessels sailing from ports in England, Holland, France, and increasingly, the American colonies like Nantucket and New Bedford, and you start to get a sense of the scale. Each man with a story, each man with aching bones, each man with a family he might never see again, or perhaps no family at all. Just a desperate hope for a slightly less terrible tomorrow that rarely dawned. They were, in many ways, the invisible fuel that powered a very visible industry. And why? Why this monumental effort? This willingness to send thousands of men into a frozen hell to wrestle with sea monsters? The answer, as it so often is, comes down to money and need. In the 17th century, before the discovery of petroleum, whale oil was liquid gold. It was the stuff that lit the lamps of London, Amsterdam, and Boston, pushing back the darkness in homes, streets, and businesses. It lubricated the primitive but burgeoning machinery of early industry. It was used in the production of soap, textiles, and a dozen other goods that a growing Europe and colonial America demanded. Think about that the next time you flick a light switch. For centuries, the simple act of reading a book after sunset, or working a night shift in a workshop, was made possible by men like Silas, enduring unimaginable horrors. Then there was the baleen, those long, flexible, keratinous plates from the mouths of right whales, the whalebone of corsetry and fashion. This was the stuff that gave structure to the elaborate gowns of aristocratic ladies, the hoops that widened their skirts, the stiff collars that framed noblemen's faces. It was a luxury item, a symbol of status and refinement. And the irony, oh, the bitter, stinking irony, is almost too much to bear. Men like Silas, smelling perpetually of rancid oil and blood, living in squalor, their bodies broken by relentless labor, were out there risking life and limb so that someone, somewhere, whom they would never meet and could never imagine, could achieve the perfect hourglass figure or a more impressive silhouette at court. They toiled in freezing squalor to provide the raw materials for the height of fashion and comfort, luxuries they themselves would never, ever experience. The contrast is so stark it's almost a caricature, a cruel cosmic joke written in oil and bone. Their suffering enabled more than just pretty dresses and well-lit drawing rooms. It fueled economies. Whaling was a cornerstone of maritime trade for many nations. It spurred shipbuilding, rope-making, coopering, barrel-making, think of all those oil casks, and a host of ancillary industries. It trained generations of seamen, many of whom would later serve in navies, further projecting the power of empires. The profits, when a voyage was successful, and many weren't, disease, shipwreck, or just plain bad luck could ruin a venture, could be enormous, making ship owners and investors very wealthy men indeed. Men who, it's safe to say, rarely set foot on the greasy deck of a whaler in the North Atlantic. And what of Silas and his ilk? How are they remembered? Well, mostly they're not. History, as it's so often written, tends to focus on the kings and queens, the generals and admirals, the wealthy merchants who financed the expeditions. We remember the names of the ships sometimes, or the captains if they were particularly successful or famously disastrous. But the common sailor, the harpooner, the boat steerer, the cook's mate, the ship's boy, they are largely erased, footnotes at best. Their names might appear on faded crew lists, often misspelled, or in scant records of death by drowning, falling from mast, or taken by whale. They are the ghosts in the machine, the thousands upon thousands, whose collective agony built fortunes and lit the world, yet who remain largely anonymous. It's a familiar story, isn't it? The great achievements of civilization, the pyramids, the cathedrals, the empires, the industrial revolutions, they all stand on a bedrock of forgotten human suffering. For every celebrated architect, there were 1,000 laborers hauling stone. For every visionary industrialist, there were countless workers in the dark, satanic mills. The men of the whaling fleets were no different. They were cogs, expendable and easily replaced, in a vast, brutal machine designed to extract wealth from the ocean. And here's a thought to warm your modern, centrally heated heart. Does this pattern ever really change? Or does it just morph? we sit here surrounded by conveniences unimaginable to Silas. We complain if our Wi-Fi is slow or if our ethically sourced, artisanally roasted coffee is a degree too cool. But the complex supply chains that bring us our gadgets, our clothes, our food, they still have dark corners. There are still people toiling in dangerous, poorly paid conditions, out of sight and out of mind, to produce the things we consume so casually. The names and places change, the specific miseries evolve, but the fundamental dynamic of some suffering for the comfort and profit of others, that has a stubbornly long shelf life. It's not about feeling guilty for living in the modern world. It's about remembering. It's about acknowledging that the past wasn't some quaint, charming adventure. For most people like Silas Blackwood, it was a relentless, often brutal, struggle for survival. Their lives were short, their comforts few, their dangers immense. They weren't heroes in shining armor. They were ordinary men, probably flawed and frequently foul-mouthed, pushed to extraordinary limits, doing jobs that we, in our comfortable present, can barely comprehend. And their story, their largely unwritten, unsung story, is a vital, if deeply uncomfortable part of our own. Because without their blood, sweat, and frozen tears, the world we inhabit simply wouldn't exist. Food for thought. Next time you find yourself complaining about a bit of bad weather, at least it's unlikely to involve being dragged across a freezing ocean by an enraged 50-ton mammal. Probably. So what became of Silas Blackwood, our weary wanderer of the waves, harpooner aboard the Misery's Price? Did he strike it rich? Did he return to Nantucket a hero, buy a cozy cottage for Martha and the kids, and live out his days telling tall tales by a warm fire, his calloused hands finally at rest? Let's be honest. This is the weary wanderer. We don't really do fairy tale endings here, mostly because history rarely supplied them to men in Silas's line of work. The truth is, the odds were stacked phenomenally high against him. The life expectancy for a 17th century whaler was, to put it mildly, not great. If the back-breaking labor, the constant exposure to brutal weather, and the wretched diet didn't get you, there were 1,000 other ways to meet an untimely end. You could be taken by a whale, dragged overboard by a fouled line, crushed by a thrashing fluke, or have your boat stove in miles from the mothership. You could fall from the rigging during a storm, a tiny speck swallowed by the indifferent ocean. Disease was rampant. Scurvy, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. Take your pick. A simple infection from a cut, like the one Silas was nursing on his hands, could easily turn fatal in a world without antibiotics. Then there were the occupational hazards of the try-works. Horrific burns, or the ever-present risk of the ship itself catching fire, turning their floating factory into a blazing coffin. Escape from this life? Slim to vanishing. Whaling voyages could last for years. Men often signed on deep in debt to the ship's owners for their initial outfitting, the slop chest. And their meager share of the profits, the lay, was often consumed by these debts, fines, or the captain's exorbitant charges for necessities. Many men ended one voyage only to immediately sign on for another, trapped in a cycle of debt and drudgery. For Silas, at 38, with 22 years already served, the sea was likely all he knew. The skills of a harpooner weren't exactly transferable to, say, quiet farming or shopkeeping. He was, in essence, a highly specialized cog in a very specific, very brutal machine. His likely fate? Perhaps he lasted a few more voyages. Perhaps he rose to become a boat officer himself, shouting at a new generation of greenhorns. More likely, he eventually succumbed. Maybe it was a fast fish that pulled him under. or a loose fish that smashed his boat to splinters. Perhaps it was a quieter, more ignominious end. A racking cough that settled deep in his chest and slowly stole his breath in the stinking confines of the forecastle. Or maybe, just maybe, he got lucky. Maybe he survived long enough to be deemed too old, too broken for the chase, and was spat out by the industry, left to eke out his final years on whatever meager savings he'd managed to hoard, his body a roadmap of old injuries, his nights filled with the ghosts of whales and drowned shipmates. A happy ending it was not. And what is the legacy of men like Silas? You won't find statues erected in their honor, no grand monuments bearing their names. Their legacy is quieter, more insidious perhaps. It's in the faint, lingering smell of old whale oil in the timbers of restored Nantucket homes. It's in the faded scrimshaw, those intricate carvings on whale teeth and bone, often the only creative outlet for these brutalized men. Tiny, poignant pieces of art born from immense suffering. It's in the well-oiled, pun absolutely intended gears of early industrial machines that their labor helped to lubricate. Their true legacy, though, might be in the systems they were part of. Systems that, in different guises, persist. The relentless pursuit of natural resources, often with little regard for the human or environmental cost. The creation of vast wealth for a few, built on the backs and the broken bodies of many. The idea that some lives are simply more expendable than others in the grand calculus of profit and progress. These aren't comfortable thoughts, but the echoes of Silas's world are still with us, if we choose to listen. The routes they charted, the hunting grounds they discovered, paved the way for future exploitation, sometimes of the whales themselves to near extinction, sometimes of other resources. The techniques they perfected, brutal as they were, formed a knowledge base for generations. But here's the thing. Despite the horror, despite the filth and the violence and the crushing despair, Silas Blackwood was human. He wasn't just a statistic, not just an anonymous sufferer. He had a name. He had presumably a wife, Martha, and 2 children he barely knew but likely thought of in the darkest watches of the night. He felt the cold, the pain, the fear. He probably felt a flicker of pride after a well-thrown harpoon, even if it was quickly extinguished by exhaustion. He might have shared a grim joke with Finn, or felt a pang of something akin to sympathy for young Daniel. He found meaning in small things, perhaps. The brief warmth of a rare cup of tea, the sight of a sunrise that wasn't immediately followed by a fatal accident, the simple act of surviving another day. We mustn't romanticize his suffering, but we must acknowledge his humanity. To do otherwise is to make him a caricature, a mere symbol of misery. And that's not fair to the real men who live these lives. So the next time you're complaining that your artisanal coffee is merely lukewarm, or that your heated car seats are taking a moment too long to warm up on a chilly morning, maybe spare a thought for Silas. Picture him in the bow of the reckless few, soaked to the bone in freezing spray, his hands raw and bleeding, facing down a creature the size of a small building, with nothing but a pointy stick and a rapidly dwindling supply of hope. Think of him trying to choke down weevil-infested hardtack in a gale, or attempting to sleep amidst the stench and screams of a crowded forecastle while his shipmates died of scurvy beside him. It might just put your own hardships into a slightly different perspective. A darkly humorous perspective, of course. This is the Weary Wanderer, after all. We wouldn't want you to get too comfortable. Let's leave Silas there for a moment, frozen in our minds. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as an embodiment of endurance. Imagine him at the end of that hellish day, coated in grime and the blood of a leviathan, every muscle screaming, his spirit battered but not entirely broken. He's leaning against the rail of the misery's price, the fires of the try-works casting a hellish glow on his exhausted face, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. He's staring out at the black, unforgiving sea, the same sea that will likely be his grave, yet the only world he truly knows. Forgotten by the grand narratives of history, yet utterly essential to them. A weary wanderer indeed, on a voyage that seemed to have no end save the final one. Remember him.